In this segment, we will be showing you how to remove a crank set from a square tapered bottom bracket. We then will remove the bottom bracket, show you how to clean everything, then reinstall the bottom bracket, and then reinstall the crank set. Now, we need to get this top bolt off here that holds the crank arm on. So we're going to use our 8mm Allen to do that. Insert the square end, never the rounded side. Loosen it to the left while holding the opposite side. Now you can use the rounded side. Now, carefully remove the bolt and put it off to the side and somewhere you won't lose it. Now we will take our crank puller and thread that into the drive side crank arm. It is important to thread in as many threads from the crank puller into the crank arm. This ensures that the threads will not strip when you go to pull off the crank arm. I will now use an adjustable wrench to crank down on the crank puller, and this will ensure that as many threads are in as possible. Now that the crank puller is threaded in properly, I can now spin the lever towards the right on the crank puller, which then will push against the spindle on the bottom bracket, which will then pull off the crank arm. This next step may require some effort, as there may be a lot of corrosion and force holding the crank arm on. So I will use the opposite crank arm to hold as leverage. As you can see there, now our drive side crank arm has been pulled off. Now set your drive side crank arm off to the side, pull off the crank puller, and then we will be doing the exact same thing on the non-drive side. Once again, unthread your hex bolt, then install the crank puller, tighten it down, spin the crank puller to the right, and then now your non-drive side is also removed. The bottom bracket that we are removing is a square tapered English thread bottom bracket. Now we will be removing the bottom bracket. We will first start on the non-drive side using our bottom bracket removal tool. We want to align all of the splines on the tool with the splines on the bottom bracket. We then will turn the tool to the left, which will loosen the non-drive side part of the bottom bracket. After you get the non-drive side part of the bottom bracket loose with the tool, you should be able to just loosen the rest by hand. Now we will move on to the drive side. This part of the bottom bracket is threaded differently than the non-drive side. In this case, to loosen it, we will be turning the tool to the right. We now will use Simple Green, which is a cleaner and degreaser, to clean inside the hole where the bottom bracket is. Now that you've sprayed Simple Green inside the hole where the bottom bracket is, you can clean inside using the rag to get any grease or dirt that is left inside. This makes sure that this area is prepped for bottom bracket reinstallation. Move the rag around inside of the threads. This will help clean everything off. Now that you've pulled out the bottom bracket and have cleaned everything thoroughly, we're going to reinstall our replacement bottom bracket. But first, you want to use your Park Polylube PPL2 grease and put that on the threads. Make sure to put a nice even coating of grease all the way around the threads. Now remember, it's a left-hand thread to tighten, so I like to get it moving towards the right until it clicks, and then you're ready to start turning it left, because it is vitally important that you do not cross-thread your bottom bracket. Using the bottom bracket tool once more, we now can tighten and secure the drive side of the bottom bracket. Once it's secure and tight, we then can move on to the non-drive side. Now for the non-drive side, we will be repeating the exact same process as before. However, we will be tightening to the right. Now you have completed the bottom bracket reinstallation. We now can move on to reattaching the crank arms. So now we're ready to reinstall the crank. This crank is in good shape. As you can see, the square is still square. Sometimes what can happen is that gets rounded off. That's when you're going to need a new crank. But this one is ready to go. Just going to put that hand tight. I like to just put the chain on that side. I'm going to grab one of our bolts. To reinstall the crank, you do not need the crank puller. The crank puller is only used to pull it off. Now we will just take our 8mm hex tool and tighten down the bolt, which will secure the crank arm. Using the ball end, you'll want to turn the bolt to the right, and then once it starts to snug up, you then want to use the squared off side to tighten it down fully. Now your drive side crank arm is installed. Now we just have to install the non-drive side arm. When installing the non-drive side crank arm, make sure that both arms are in the opposite direction of each other. This ensures that your bike will be rideable. Once you have the non-drive side crank arm secure, just reattach the chain and you're ready to ride.